Hello and welcome to the album man. Today I'm going to be continuing Rocktail's metal origins, my look at the origins of heavy metal, and I highly suggest you check out part 1 if you haven't already. There'll be a link in the description below to that, just so you really understand the continuity and the flow of this look at the origins of metal. So in this part we're going to be particularly focusing on the development of the fuzz box and the increased use of feedback, as well as the development of rock music and just the wider use of distortion in the late 50s to early to mid 60s. Now, before we get to the core of this episode, I feel that it's really important to note the influence not just of some slightly distorted guitar found in early rock and roll, but just the general sound of the major artists in rock and roll music. Little Richard and Chuck Berry, I believe, are both crucial to the development of metal and, to be honest, of rock music as well. But not because they had the fuzziest, loudest guitars, since that wasn't the case, particularly with Little Richard. The key reasons are twofold. Firstly, the theatrical way in which they performed, from Berry's Duck Walk. To Little Richard's adrenaline-fueled energy. Secondly, the intensity of their music. Heaviness should not just be measured in terms of distortion or volume. Heavy sound in music can simply be something intense, exhilarating, electric and hard-hitting. Performance that just knocks you to the ground, which these performers did in abundance, especially with the speed of the vocals and the other instruments, which, well, now don't sound very fast. In their day, this was some fast-paced music. This would impact heavily on the musical counterculture in Britain in the 60s with the British invasion bands, which was certainly key in laying down the foundations of metal. And as Lemmy of Motorhead said, Little Richard is directly responsible for Motorhead. I heard Good Golly, Mrs. Molly, and that was the end of it. Good golly, Mrs. Molly, sure like the ball. Golly, Mrs. Molly, sure like the ball. Rockin' animal, kill mama call. How can we talk about the late 1950s without mentioning Link Wray's timeless instrumental Rumble, released in 1958, a song that was banned from US radio because it was believed that the harsh, distorted tone and the title Rumble, being slang apparently for gang fight, could encourage violence. Now, while this seems laughable in 2015 when we find Marilyn Manson to be moderate, in 1958 this was a big deal. Distortion-wise and meta-wise, this is often listed as the first intentional use of the effect, but I believe the existence of Pat Hare proves that wrong. But Link Wray certainly brought distortion to the masses, selling over 1 million copies and being adored by Jimmy Page and being called the greatest instrumental of all time by Bob Dylan.
I'd listen to anything with the guitar on when I was a kid, you know, that was being played, and all those different approaches and the echoes. But the first time I heard the Rumble, it was like, that was something that had so much profound attitude to it.
It really does.
It really does. Now he's starting to increase vibrato on his amplifier. You hear blah, 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 blah. It gets more intense.
The Native American guitarist with these simple chords chords would certainly inspire a generation to seek a heavier sound. Wray would famously push pencils through the speakers of his amp to create the abrasive sounds found, and combined with the tremolo at the ends, it's just eerie yet really simple to play. Now Wikipedia and many others cite this as the first use of the power chord, which I strongly disagree with based on my own research. In the past we've looked at Willie Johnson in 1951 with Howlin' Wolf, who certainly seemed to be playing something that sounded and looked a lot like a power chord in 1951. And well, there aren't really many power chords in Ray's song.
If we look at the theory behind Rumble, we'll find that it's not that complex of a song. It's just a simple blues chord progression in 4/4 time, rotating around the D chord. And the only reason that this song is ever cited as one of the first uses of the power chord is just because that D chord is played as a D5. And while technically that constitutes a power chord, it seems a far cry from that used by Black Sabbath in 1969.
To me, this song's influence comes from its widespread appeal and fame, not necessarily from its technical innovation. I mean, I love this instrumental, especially when it's used in Pulp Fiction, but Link Wray did not really actually add that much to the quest for heavy. He just popularised what was otherwise a fairly niche idea. Have you ever heard of Marty Robbins? If you have, you'll know him as a pretty damn successful country and pop singer who also used to do NASCAR racing, and one of his biggest hits was Don't Worry. Let's hear a little bit, shall we?
Don't worry about me, it's all over now.
Now, what if I tell you that this song provided the genesis for the sound of the Rolling Stones and the start of the sounds that revolutionised rock music? Well, you'd probably say something like, well, what the hell do I know? This sounds like a country song, you can hear piano here. What the hell are you on about? This is just a very 50s, 60s distinct country song. But now listen to the solo at 1:39.
Don't worry about me.
Kind of comes out of nowhere, and it does feel a little odd in the context of the song. In fact, it feels very odd. It's a weirdly distorted 6-string bass, and if you compare it to the sounds of the distortion we've come across earlier, this just has a different timbre to it from what we've heard up to this point. It sounds, well, fuzzier. St. Martin Robbins' Don't Worry is really the first song to utilise fuzz.
In the summer of 1960, Nashville studio engineer Glenn Snoddy invented the fuzz tone. He was recording Don't Worry with session guitarist Grady Martin, and during the recording, Martin's 6-string bass was plugged into a Langevin tube amp module, which malfunctioned and began to distort. And this effect was left on the song, even though Marty Robbins was not keen on it at all. Snoddy quickly realised the commercial potential and began trying to build a device which could replicate it as he recorded. We fooled around with it and got the sounds like we wanted. I drove up to Chicago and presented it to Mr. Berlin, the boss at the Gibson company, and he heard that it was something different, so they agreed to take it and put it out as a commercial product. Gibson introduced the product as the Fuzztone FZ1 on their Maestro brand in 1962, producing 5,000 units, and consumers didn't really know what to do with it, and it was in fact originally intended to be used on a bass to emulate a tenor or baritone saxophone. It was only really in 1965 when Keith Richards used this pedal on I Can't Get No Satisfaction that it became a hit, and that is when it became a mandatory piece of equipment for every rock and subsequently metal guitarist in one incarnation or another. But that doesn't mean we're quite skipping to 1965 yet.
We continue in 1961 with another artist and song which helped break the boundaries of music for the heavier and the louder.
Before Deep Purple and Motorhead were blowing people's eardrums apart, a guy named Dick Dale was trying to do the same. Dale is most famous for his classic instrumental Let's Go Trippin', which is often credited as the first surf rock song, preceding the Beach Boys by a couple of months. It was more of his live sound, though, that he began to really revolutionise. He was one of the first to play a new type of guitar created by Leo Fender, the Fender Stratocaster. The problem was that Dick kept blowing up his amps because he played so loud, to the point where they would actually catch fire, and he went through 49 amplifiers. And Leo Fender asked him, "Dick, why do you have to play so loud?" His response was that he wanted a sound which would bowl over his audiences, something primal, a roaring sound like the crashing of the waves. So what did Fender do? He created an 85 watt output transformer that peaked at 100 watts, enabling him to pump up the amp volume. But they also needed a speaker which could handle this without burning up, so Leo went to the James B. Lansing Speaker Company, where they explained that they wanted a 15-inch speaker to enable Dick to play loud. When Dick received this, he was the first to jump from the modest volume scale of 4 to taking it up to 10, becoming one of the forgotten forefathers in metal's search for a loud, heavy sound. He was the loudest around and the king of surf guitar.
It was not until 1962 that the fuzz tone established with Marty Robbins suddenly came into its own. Distortion was now no longer accidental or as a result of attacking the speaker or just playing so loud that the sound actually distorted. No, it was a box, a deliberate tone. 2,000 Pound B by The Ventures, very odd name for a song, I know, is the first time this fuzz box was used in a studio recording, well, certainly to my knowledge. Interestingly, while inspired by the fuzz on Marty Robbins, this does not actually use the Gibson Maestro fuzz tone, but it uses a separate one created by Red Rhodes, which was developed in parallel with Gibson's. This song is, without question, the heaviest song we've covered so far, and while part 1 is just heavily based on the 12-bar blues, the distortion cuts through the mix, with the song being specifically designed with fuzz in mind. This is really one of the first times. It wasn't just, oh, this happens to be fuzzy, let's go along with it. This was written for fuzz. Interesting is part 2 of the song, which appears to have proto-punk elements to it, particularly with that driving drum beat, but yet it still follows relative blues convention. I would say, looking back at it in retrospect, this seems to have more of a modern garage rock, indie rock sound to it, but looking at it tonally as it was back then, this was as heavy as it got. Were the last for a few years to really make notable impacts on the development of all that is heavy, but their influence was certainly a major one. It was in 1964 that the race really heated up. This was the point when the search for metal intensified. From this point onwards, it took off. It became wider. More and more bands started pioneering music as just music started to get wilder and more raucous. And now we journey from the States to Britain as the Kinks changed music forever with You Really Got Me.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, you really got me now. You got me so I can't sleep at night. Yeah, you
a sensation and launched the Kinks into stardom. The key to it really is that wonderfully distorted Dave Davis riff. So simple yet ingenious, this is what launched the power chord into the mainstream. It demonstrated its potential just so brilliantly, inspiring a whole generation of young guitarists to play in a heavier way. Though the song was not always this way. In fact, Ray Davies wrote it originally on piano as a jazz-type tune, inspired by Jimmy Guiffre's 1957 single The Train and the River. And was written around a saxophone line which Dave Davis decides to play on guitar with that classic fuzzy tone, and thus the riff was born. But how did Davis achieve that tone? Well, he was one of the last guitarists we'll look at to use the old-school damaged amp method, since by the mid-60s distortion pedals and fuzz boxes had become more widely used. Davis explained, "I was very depressed and fooling around with a razor blade. I could easily have slashed my wrists, but I had a little green amplifier and Ellipco that was sounding crap. I thought, I'll teach it, and slashed the speaker cone." Davis explained, "It changed the sound of my guitar. Then when I wired that amp up to another, a Vox AC30, it made it a lot louder."
The real question is, was this song the birthplace of metal? Was this the first ever metal song? Myself, I don't think so. Firstly, I would argue that this song bears more of a resemblance to punk than metal, and I think most would agree that they're relatively distinct genres. That use of repetitive power chord sequence certainly seems more proto-punk, I would say. Secondly, this song does sound primitive compared to metal that will come later. Sure, metal is a very nebulous term, including huge differences in sounds between bands. I mean, both Porcupine Tree and Cannibal Corpse are metal, yet on the surface they bear very little similarity. In fact, they just do bear very little similarity. This is really just one of the first proto-metal songs, a crucial building block, but not the finished article. I would argue that its influence is potentially overstated, as there are many who will argue that without this song, that metal would not exist, that this was a necessary song to the genre's existence. But that just isn't true. I'm not saying You Really Got Me wasn't influential, but I think there's a concept we really need to talk about before we proceed further into looking at the origins of metal. This is an idea in science called the principle of multiple discoveries, and it's the idea that most discoveries and inventions are made by multiple people independently of one another and quite often simultaneously. Famous examples of this include the invention of the telephone, in which both Alexander Graham Bell and Elisha Gray filed patents within 3 hours of each other on the same day. And to the question, if Thomas Edison hadn't been born, would we have had light bulbs? Yeah, we probably would, because there were at least 23 people who built prototypes before Edison and even took Edison to court over patents. And while Newton was definitely a mathematical genius, Leibniz had also stumbled upon calculus. You get the gist, and this applies to metal as well. Sure, the Kinks revolutionised the sound, particularly in Britain, of rock, but there were many people looking for this sound, from Pat Hare in the 50s to Dick Dale in the 60s. There is no one necessary band to the genre's development, and for every band we call so influential and so important, there probably would have been another one who would have come up and we also would have lauded as the most important and most influential. All I would say of the Kinks that is for sure is that they were one of the prime factors in there being a boom in the mid to late 60s of heavier rock music, and they would certainly help launch the generation that built the metal we know and love today.
People try to put us to down, talking about my generation, just because we get around.